Range anxiety, the fear that your vehicle will run out of energy before you reach the next available filling station or charging station, is a real thing for vehicle drivers around the world. And while many EV advocates will point out that there are many, many more EV charging points than filling stations around the world, because at a pinch, a basic household outlet can be a charging station, many people are leery of making the switch to EVs because of the real and perceived challenges of finding charging stations in their area, or indeed, just failing to understand how charging for electric vehicles and the energy they use works. I've had plenty of conversations with EV advocates and industry insiders before about this issue, but I've never had the chance to talk to an academic about the challenges and potential remedies to charging anxiety, at least until today, because I'm going to be talking to Frances Sprei, one of the authors on a new research paper called Mental Models Guide Electric Vehicle Charging. Co-authored with Professor Willett Kempton of the College of Earth, Ocean and Environment and Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Delaware, the just-released paper examines the conceptual and behavioural barriers to EV charging and lays out how some changes in mental models can help alleviate range anxiety in new and experienced EV owners, all without changing a vehicle's battery pack size or capability when it comes to fast charging. Frances Sprei from Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden assesses different personal mobility options such as electric vehicles and innovative mobility forms such as car sharing and micromobility. Economic, political, technical and behavioural aspects are taken into account in her research. Her research methods are interdisciplinary, combining quantitative methods such as econometrics with qualitative methods such as interviews. She's an active person within outreach and policy advice. She's the chair of the Research Council for the regional Västra Gotland climate transition, a board member of Transport and Environment, and more. She was a member of the Working Group for Fossil-Free Transport within the Swedish government's collaborative programme for the climate transition of business. So she's well qualified to discuss this particular topic. Frances, thank you so much for joining me today and for agreeing to do this interview. Let's start by discussing how you went about laying out your research process as a whole.
Well, yes. So I had been doing research for quite a few years about electric vehicles, a little, and about driving behaviors, about charging and so on. And then I met at a conference the co-author of the study, the Professor Willett Kempton, and we started talking and we realized that some of the observations we had seen and the differences with how you use an electric vehicle versus a conventional vehicle, a gasoline or a diesel vehicle, that we had seen some common threads. And so we thought it would be interesting to study this a little bit more methodologically, like a little bit more stringent than just being, oh, these are some observations we've done from a bunch of different research background. So I had some material from interviews that I'd done from what we called an EV trial with like early EVs with short range. The first round of interviews, we hadn't really discovered this mental models. We were more, since it was short range EVs at the time, we were talking more, our interviews were focused on how families adapted to a short range electric vehicle. And so we saw what that material contained, and then we wanted to see with more modern EVs and with people who had actually been using EVs during a longer period of time, that is more than 6 months, how they were like reasoning around charging models, behaviors, and how much they understood of like the charging process, if we put that, and the mechanics around the car and the battery and so on.
So Gothenburg has been at the forefront of EV test fleets for more than a decade now. Volvo was one of the very first automakers to establish testing for cold weather environments and worked with local early adopters to investigate with a fleet of C30 electrics There's a very different process that you go through as an EV owner if you are joining an early program versus just being a consumer going down to your local car showroom and buying the latest EV. Can you talk me through the differences that you noticed between those early adopters and a wider EV driving population?
Well, I think part of the differences had to do with how long time they've had them, and to be honest, also the range of the vehicle. So the early ones when we had, which were not part of this C30, this was another study that we had at Chalmers University of Technology. And so there they had an EV that was like the range actually of like 120 kilometers or something like that. So that does make a difference, the amount of range that they had. But I think one of the main differences was also the amount of time that people had. And probably also if you've made a conscious decision to actually buy an EV versus if you've asked, oh, do you want to be part of this program? I think one of the advantages when we did that early trial, that by asking people and not having them to commit to buying an EV, we didn't get the really early adopters. Because the really early adopters, they have their own type of mindset and normally know about it a lot. So some of these people that we had in the first trial, they didn't know much about EVs. They thought, okay, this can be a little cool thing, fun to join, but maybe didn't have much knowledge about EVs.
When you're driving an internal combustion engine vehicle, whether it's petrol or diesel, there's very much I just look for the sign of the petrol station or the filling station, and I go and I fill up and then I carry on my journey. In an electric vehicle world, because of the time that we take to charge, because of the limitations of certain sites, there's a whole lot of different things that have to be taken into consideration. But in your study, which anyone can read now, it's available online, you talk about there being 3 principal different attitudes towards recharging your electric car. Perhaps you'd like to introduce us to them.
Yes. So I think the first is the one like the internal combustion engine or gauge, looking at the fuel gauge like you do with an internal combustion engine. Basically, you see like, oh, I'm almost empty. I need to either recharge or I need to refuel, depending on what type of vehicle you have, right? So if you end up there, then it's like this having to monitor all the time. Oh, what's the state of charge of the battery? How am I doing? How far can I get? Where's the charging station and so on? And when you're, as you were saying, when you're in a internal combustion engine vehicle, petrol or diesel engine vehicle, it's fairly easy because they are everywhere. They're visible. We know. And you also kind of have a feeling of how far can I drive before I can reach them. So that's the first one. The second one that we identified was plan ahead. So here is when you want to go on a longer trip with your electric vehicle. Then you know, like, oh, I want to go on a trip. It's 600 kilometers away. My range is only roughly 400 kilometers. I need to plan in a stop where I charge. And so there, normally, given how it is today, you might have apps that help you, support you in that, or otherwise you find out yourself, oh, but after I've driven these amount of hours, it's good anyway maybe to take a stop to have a lunch, or I need to take away a break anyway. I recharge how much that I need, and then I continue on my trip. But you have to kind of plan it. You can't normally just be like, oh, I'm driving and feeling like, oh, I'll hope I'll find a charging station soon. And most EV users, experienced ones, actually plan ahead on when they're going to stop. And then the third one is the one we call event actuated, which is the common one for everyday charging or the usual driving that you have. And it's the fact that a lot of EV users, they have some kind of event. It could be coming home. We had some in our interviews that it was walking the dog or something like that, when you like decide to plug in. And then when you do this on a regular basis, you basically always have enough charging to do your everyday driving that you need to do. And this means that you don't actually have to put in a lot of planning, thinking, seeing how much charge do I have left and so on, because you always know that when you get into the morning of your car, it's full or almost full if it's a worst case scenario, but enough charge to at least make you drive up your different ends. And this could be also if you don't have charging at home. For some, it can be getting to work can be that event that also actuates you, starts you into the idea that, okay, yeah, I have to plug in and charge.
The established EV driver watching this will most likely look at the second and the third scenario here and go, well, of course, this is how I drive an EV. This is my daily, experience. I go on a long distance trip. Of course, I plan and I know where I'm going to be able to stop. And I'm coming home at the end of the day or I'm arriving at work. I know that I will be plugging the vehicle in and keeping that vehicle plugged in for a long period of time. Another thing that is mentioned in your study that, again, is very familiar, I think, to a lot of EV drivers is the lovely table that you presented showing the length of time that it takes to fill up a vehicle, and how, the actual time you are engaged in the refueling or recharging process. That was the fun one, in which you kind of drive home the nature that when you drive an electric vehicle, you really are only engaged in the process of recharging for maybe 5 seconds while you plug in, because then you can go and do something else.
I think that's one of the fundamental differences, maybe, that like with an internal combustion engine vehicle, you go away and you refuel, and it's a specific act for that. While when you're charging an electric vehicle, you're charging when it's standing still anyway, and you're engaged in something else because you don't have to monitor it.
It is something that automakers and car sales teams seem to ignore often when selling their vehicle. They hyperfixate on the gas station experience. We've even seen car companies, when they're making a new EV, bringing it to market, they'll find the charging sites that look most like a petrol station, most like a filling station. Do you think that there is a conversation that needs to be had that is not happening right now with automakers and salespeople about communicating the reality of owning and driving and charging an EV?
Yeah, definitely. I actually got a question once when I presented this study is like, oh, have you tried to interview like politicians or other actors than the users and seeing what mental models they have? And I actually realized that would be a good follow-up study to see like, well, both salespeople, automakers, but even politicians, how do they reason around charging and how that affects decisions of where you put charging infrastructure or how you even design charging infrastructure. There are some good examples. I know there's I saw once for an ad for an opening of a charging station in place where they had put like a playground for the kids, and there was a restaurant and so on, where they had realized that, okay, well, people are actually, if they are charging their vehicle en route, they're going to need to stay here maybe half an hour or something. It's good that they have something to do, and that will attract people to want to come there and charge versus maybe somewhere else in the middle of nowhere.
You also discuss in your paper how people don't intrinsically understand any of the units of measurement involving an EV. And we have a very confused landscape right now where we're using engineering terms in ways that a petrol vehicle wouldn't. So nobody ever goes to a petrol station and goes, I'm going to have the 95 octane fuel. And even if they do, they don't maybe understand what the 98 octane is or the 95 octane is. When we are discussing EVs and EV charging, there's that barrier, that confusion of technical jargon. Talk me through some of the discoveries you made in your survey and your interviews about how people referred to their perception of charging and energy.
Yeah, and I'll start talking about like when it comes to a petrol, like a liquid fuel vehicle, it's very easy to understand what's going on. You know, if you have a container, your tank, you're filling it with a liquid, you understand when it's full and when it's half empty and when it's empty, right? And you can feel like, okay, I'm filling up this liquid. It's harder to understand that, like the whole electrochemical reaction on what's actually happening with a battery. But I think there we have some help from phones, and that we have other gadgets that have come a step ahead. So this typical image of like, a cylinder or whatever it is with the different colors, that it's red and that it's moving down. So you still have an idea of something that is full or changing to small, or that it's going from green to yellow to red. Those kind of discussions, or how many percentages are left, are easier for people to engage with, because they've seen that mostly in phones, but even kind of in laptops or other electrical devices that they have around them. So that's normally how they reason, even around the car.
Did you discover in your study that some people have a negative attachment to that percentage that kind of method of reading the battery, the percentage? I know that I meet people very often who have mobile phones, tablets, whatever. And as soon as it gets to maybe 30% or 25%, when it changes from maybe green to amber or amber to red on the display, they then start to suffer what I would call an extreme range anxiety. Was there any correlation with that in your study?
So they didn't talk so much about it. I think most of them realized that some had like some kind of limit if they didn't have this super event actuated, that once it was at a certain level, then they for sure would make sure to charge if they hadn't had a chance to charge before. But that was one of the things that not a lot of the more experienced EV users didn't talk so much about range anxiety. And some of them even talked about the fact that, but you can have range anxiety even with a petrol vehicle, because you can end up in a situation where you're like, how close is it to a gas station? So it wasn't really so much that they didn't focus on that part of it, that was any major issue for them, actually. They all felt that either they had this more planned than every day, or that they would even plan when they went on their trips to make sure not to end up in that situation.
What do you feel is ultimately causing the biggest challenge to how people think about charging and the barriers that exist? Because a lot of the concerns that people have about switching to an EV and using charging come from a lack of knowledge and familiarity. And in your study, you talk about the need to change to more appropriate models, like looking at some of the respondents who have already made that transition to more appropriate models, and comparing that to people who want to jump maybe behind the wheel of an EV, but are using fairly old excuses, maybe excuses that have been disproven by a lot of the participants in the study. How do you engage with people who have yet to buy an EV on how to change how they think about the fueling process?
Well, I think the first step is to make sure also that they have like a home charging. And it doesn't have to mean home charging such as like right by your house, but very close to your house, so that you can engage in, so you can find this kind of event actuated charging, so you know that you can regularly charge. Because we also saw that one of the participants in our study had discontinued their EV ownership because they didn't have that, and then it became much too difficult to navigate that. So I think sometimes there's an overemphasis on like, oh, is there fast charging somewhere or where is it? No, the important thing to start with is to make sure, is there any place where I can regularly charge that is close to my home? So for people living in detached houses, it's very easy. Normally that's like their own, it's where they park their car. For a lot of people living in apartment buildings, it's ensuring that the apartment building, if there's a parking space for it, that those get access to charging. And for people that have street parking, I guess it depends a little bit about how the city, the municipality, or whatever they decide to deal with, if they have on-street charging or if they do it through hubs or different solutions. So I think that's one important thing to start with, to be aware of that that's the most important charging places. Then the fast charging or the other charging, you'll discover after a while, and maybe get those informed about the apps, just seeing. I've talked to people where they say, oh, I can't have an EV because where we have our summer house, that's very common in Sweden, there's no charging there. And I was like, what's the name of the village you have? And then I look on one of my apps and I say, oh, well, look here, there are actually these and these charging points. And they're like, uh-huh. So that's also one thing that, not through our study here, but I know that they've done studies in California where they've had focus groups with people who have EVs and people who don't have EVs. And they're very different perceptions about how much charging there is available around them, because people who don't have EVs just don't see the charging that is available.
How can governments, whether it's local, national, international, help spread positive charging experiences and positive charging practices? Because at the moment, governments around the world seem to be focused on incentivizing people to buy EVs, but then, as you say, heavy emphasis on motorway, highway, freeway charging, but not necessarily on what from reading the study, what seemed to be the most common mode of charging, which is that event charging, that I have arrived, I'm plugging in. How can we fill that gap to stop focusing on the fast charging and actually getting more usable, convenient charging?
Well, I think there are policies that have been going in the right direction. In the EU, at least, they have in the building directive decided that like new buildings have to be ready for charging. I know that there are in California similar policies. So those type of policies are really important. But then you have to get to all the people that are not living in, new buildings. The majority of the people live in old buildings or existing housing. And therefore, it's important to start getting into ensuring that those parking lots also get access to charging. And that can be, there can be maybe subsidies for those, or also just helping navigating on how can you... In some situations in Sweden, for example, you have these commonly owned parking places, so on. How do you ensure that billing is happening in the right way, and having information about to support these housing organizations to be able to provide that, but also giving information to these housing organizations. I think there are examples in our supplemental material in which people from housing organizations feel like, oh, it's unfair towards EV drivers that they would get charging in there. We wouldn't want to install a gasoline station in our garage, and not understanding that those are very different, different requirements for it and very different situations for it. So some educational projects also.
At what point do you think there is a transition? Is it different between different people, or is it once you've been driving for a certain period of time, a specific point of time, you can actually identify when you have been driving for 6 months, then you are comfortable? At what point does that normally cross over?
Ooh, I don't know. I don't think we have enough evidence to say at what point, because like with those that we had for 4 months, there were those that had transitioned and those that hadn't. So I guess maybe we would have to follow people during the whole first 6 months maybe of their ownership or something like that, and a large amount of people to be able to answer that. So I think it might depend from person to person, and also maybe about how much knowledge and background they have. And
I ask that specifically because a lot of automakers are now moving to subscription models for electric vehicles. Polestar, Volvo, we're seeing some in the US as well as companies in Europe. The idea that you pay a subscription to your car, and so instead of taking on that massive 4-5 year commitment to buy or lease a vehicle, they're allowed more flexibility, and I would be very, very eager to find out at what point, that transition occurs between somebody who has maybe less experience and certain worries to someone who is doesn't think twice about the ownership experience and the charging experience because they've developed those quite resilient models that you discuss in your paper. Do you think there's anything that we can do to increase positive experiences? Is it just about education? Is it a buddy program where you get somebody who's new to an EV and pair them with someone who's more experienced? Is it like osmosis? Does it just happen? Or is it something that we need to be actively engaged in?
I guess one actor that should be actively engaged in is with car dealers, those who sell the vehicles, or if they're selling these subscription programs, because I think that can influence quite a lot of people who buy the electric vehicle. Even if there is some evidence that people that come today to car dealers are much better informed than what they were maybe for 10, 15 years ago. I know previous studies, but they're getting a bit old, show that car dealers have little knowledge about electric vehicles. I hope that has changed, but I haven't seen any recent studies that has shown that. But that would be interesting also to see, like, kind of how do they talk about EVs? What do they say when they're selling? What information do they give them about needing to charge and so on? So I think that's an important part in it. And I think also some policies that can be done, even if I know I de-emphasize, I like the highway charging, but even there it could be done a little bit more to make it more visible that there are many charging stations out there. Again, going back to this, as you were saying, there are signs when you're driving on the highway when there's a petrol station, but there are just very few signs of when there's a charging station.
It's very reassuring over here in the US. We actually now have lots of highway charging signs, which does make the experience a lot easier. But very often there's a lack of information on them. So it doesn't say there's a charging station in, 5 miles down this road. It just says there's a charging station somewhere off this exit. And obviously it can be anxiety inducing if you are unfamiliar with the vehicle, you're unfamiliar with the area, to go, okay, how many miles do I need to go before finding charging, and what type of charging is it? And all of those other questions, which can increase the anxiety in a new driver, not so much with an experienced owner.
No, but and signaling, and you kind of got to one of the things, signaling also what type of charger, because there's a huge difference if you've taken left off turn and you need a fast charger and you come up and it's like if you're going to use this, like the technical jargon, like 22 kilowatt or whatever, which might not be enough. So just also finding ways of easily communicating what type of charger it is also important, because it depends, sometimes you need a fast charger. Sometimes it's okay with a slower charger. And as an experienced EV driver, you know that, but you want to know what type of charger you'll be getting to.
What's next for your academic journey in regard to EVs? What's next for the research program that you've built on this with your colleagues?
So I unfortunately don't have anything directly collaborating with Willett at the moment. We are looking at, through another type of project, at the possibility for vehicle to grid, like when you discharge the vehicle and how much availability is there on that. I've also ventured into research on trucks instead, and charging infrastructure for trucks. And then I also have an application in which I hope to look at, in which I want to survey a larger population, even in areas where there's not that many EVs, and how their perceptions, and seeing maybe a little bit about these mental models to a larger group of people.
It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for staying late at your university to talk to me. I know there's I think 9 hours difference between the west coast of the US and Sweden. So thank you very much, Frances Sprei.
Thank you
very, very much. And I look forward to hearing from your pursuits in the future.
Well, thank you. Thank you for bringing this up. And I think this is also an important part of it, that we talk about these issues in more forums.
Thanks for joining me today. And if you've got thoughts, make sure you leave them below in our Discord chat room, or you can reach out to us on Mastodon. Thanks to the amazing list of people scrolling by on your screen right now. They are some of the more than 1,500 people that help make this channel possible by funding it through Patreon and YouTube, covering our bills, paying our team, and making sure we can be 100% independent. If you'd like to join them and see your name listed here, just follow the links below. There are a range of different tiers you can sign up for, from as little as $1 a month, or if you pay yearly, $10.08 a year. A massive welcome to our newest supporters, Ralph Koenig, Mr. Eldritch, Dwayne Adiger, and Corey Singletray. To join our list and get your shout out, become a paid Patreon member for your week of fame. If you'd like to support us with a one-off donation, you'll also find links below to make Ko-fi and Bitcoin donations, and we even have an old-fashioned PO box you can reach us at. The address is listed below. And of course, if you're in need of some swag, you'll find our swag store link in the down below as well. This month, we are celebrating Wrangling EV FUD with a fantastic t-shirt design by our in-house artist and animator Erin. Get yours today by heading to our Redbubble store. We've got some great content coming up, so make sure you'll subscribe on PeerTube or YouTube, and we'll see you soon. We make new videos every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. If you want more, the mighty algorithm thinks you'll like this video, but we also think that this one is well worth a look. See you soon, and as always, keep evolving.